I am exceptionally pleased to be joined today by none other than Mr. EOS himself, the author, blockchain pioneer, economist, game theorist, freedom engineer, entrepreneur, future founding father, and the creator of EOSIO blockchain and EOS cryptocurrency technology, the former CTO of Block.one, and the co-creator of Steemit, BitShares, and Voice.com. Ladies and gentlemen, one of my personal heroes, I would like to welcome Mr. Dan Larimer.
Thank you so much for that welcome. I feel like somebody from Game of Thrones with that intro.
It's all downhill from now, Dan, anyway. So, Dan, the EOS community is in trouble. Lacking leadership, Block.one has remained under heavy criticism for their failure to invest in the community. Flagship projects such as Voice.com appear expensive, with potential remaining unfulfilled. The excitement of B1 June in 2019 has waned. Winners of Block.one hackathon, Dal Bull, recently said this about the broken promises in the EOS community.
I'm not going to pretend like I know what Block.one is up to or how they're investing the initial $4 billion.
I am here today with Callum, Simone, and Marco from Dal Bull. Congratulations, guys.
Ethereum is magnetic. It's magnetic, and it's magnetic because you can get funding. But in the EOS space, to be frank, it seems to lack leadership. It seems to lack any sort of communication from Block.one to the community. In 2021, if you'd told me in 2018 that that customer wouldn't even know what EOS was, how has that happened? We have questions for you that we would need to have answered. We're talking about decentralized projects here. The community is so important. And I think the community is a little salty because they know that you've raised so much money and they want to see where the money's going.
And I just want to play you a very short clip here from Zach from the longest running EOS podcast, Everything is EOS. And I think he sums up the frustration with the builders perfectly in this very short clip.
It just needs funding. Like that's what's been lacking is like the reason there's been a slow bleed within EOS is because for the first year, everyone had all the optimism that Block.one is going to deliver on something, that EOS VC was going to like fund people, and teams were willing to pay out of their own pocket, play the long game. Yeah. Okay, if I pay out of my own pocket, I might burn through $1 million, but once I burn through that $1 million, I'll be profitable because Block.one's going to be funding $1 billion into the ecosystem. Liquidity is going to arrive, yada, yada, yada. It never came. I have countless friends that I've heard firsthand, they bled through all of their capital. And once you bleed through all of your capital and there's no like finish line in sight, like it's depressing. Like, what are you supposed to do? The lights eventually shut off.
And then finally, Dan, I just want to remind the viewers what Brendan said in 2019.
So you actually finished the world's biggest sale of cryptocurrency tokens for around $4 billion back in May. What are you planning to do with that money that you raised?
Well, if you look at how token networks were distributed in the past, it was mostly through burning electricity in order to create these tokens. And so the thesis behind our token sale was to take that capital that was normally used to create tokens and then divert it back to the developers that are spawning the next generation of innovation. So we just announced a $1 billion fund for EOS VC. We're investing that with partners throughout the world back into the hands of the developers.
So Dan, Block.one has made clear promises to the community to invest $1 billion with the builders. Now, I don't want to dwell on the past, but I do think it's important for us to address this in order for us to be able to move on. Because for whatever reason, those investments didn't happen. And perhaps the community should have taken more of a lead in that and responded outside of the realm of Block.one. But real projects went bankrupt, and that's real people's lives. And I think that it didn't need to be this difficult. Many projects have left EOS and they're not going to come back. And for the ones who have stayed, it's been a real struggle. And I think those broken promises have created a lot of animosity in the community. And I understand the premise that it's not necessarily Block.one's responsibility. But what I want to like understand from you today is, why didn't Block.one deliver on this? And what can the community and what can you do to ensure that the space is never left with exsanguination again, never left with the draining of resources again?
Wow, you start out with the hard questions. The reality is, where to begin? Block.one had big ambitions, and they gave a lot of money to a lot of different organizations, these venture capital firms, to vet projects and to basically delegate it out, right? And sometimes if you want to do something right, you've got to do it yourself. But these firms had a lot of leeway, and they had a lot of legal constraints over what types of projects were actually investable. And I think this is a broader problem in the entire crypto space, that maybe a lot of projects get funding on Ethereum, but most of those projects are just burning through investor money in the long run. There's not a sustainable, viable business model behind them. Yes, they get funding. Yes, they get paid to do things. Therefore, people are excited about them. But the reality is finding $1 billion worth of projects that meet the scrutiny required to have traditional VC investment, right? You've got a management team with a proven record, you've got a product, you got a business plan, you got legal and compliance, and you're not causing extra liability for Block.one or the VC firm by investing in something that's going to go do a token sale, right? And all the ambiguity around the tokens. So you have the challenge of investing in this space in a manner that doesn't have blowback from the regulators at a time when Block.one was negotiating with the SEC, right? Or dealing with a class action lawsuit. These things are tied the hands of Block.one in a certain way. And so when the VC firms were struggling to invest in companies, or these companies would come and they would say, yes, we're going to do things, we're going to use EOS, EOSIO, and then you give them the money, and then they pivot their business model after you give them the money, and they go do something on Ethereum, right? At the time they got the money, Ethereum wasn't in the cards, but then they chase it. Or Block.one will give autonomy to the voice, right? Bring someone in from Forbes to run voice, and then voice ends up not being something from the crypto community, but being something else, just because of the need to scale the leadership, because Block.one and even myself can't manage all these other companies. It's just hard enough to manage one company, let alone a voice and an exchange and a software platform and a community, and evaluating 1 million projects for potential funding. So it's a really challenging problem of how do you responsibly delegate the money in a way that if it's properly invested should make more money and be virtuous, instead of just, oh, we spent money and then the project didn't succeed. And I think that there's no bigger example of the inability to do this than voice, where the regulations came in, the token wasn't allowed to be liquid, and now it's pivoted off to do something, and they're doing stuff with Ethereum. I mean, that is I'm just shocked at what Block.one hasn't done and what they could have done. And very, very risk adverse. But there's also responsibility on the community, and what Block.one stated is, hey, we're building this software, we're selling you the software rather than keeping 100% of the tokens for ourselves and building it and then doing whatever. We're going to sell it, and now it's in the hands of the token holders. It's like you're starting a business. It's like the original DAC analogy. Hey, I started a business. This business is going to be powered by this software. We're going to deliver the software for you guys to run the business, but it's up to you to run the business. We just sold you the business. It's like if you buy let's say you're Apple, and you buy some company from the founders, and once they deliver what they said they would deliver, if you don't run it, then it's the new owner's responsibility for the success of that. But there's a belief in that Block.one is the company, and that the money, they're supposed to be running EOS, but that was never the intent. And in fact, it couldn't be the intent, or the whole thing would have blown up. If what people wanted, which was Block.one to be EOS, then EOS could be a security. EOS would not be decentralized. And then the regulators would come down much, much harder, and all the money would have disappeared. Not to Block.one, but to the government.
So Block.one were naive to make that promise then?
Oh, Block.one invested $1 billion. They spent money on voice trying to do that, and now they're putting all the money into Bullish, with Bullish's goal to provide liquidity to EOS and Bitcoin and Ethereum. And that's a business model that is likely going to make Block.one a lot of money if they execute on it as it's designed. So, we could spend a lot of time blaming, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do this, you didn't do this. But at the end of the day, blaming other people for failures is not productive, right? It's not going to make them do what you want. It's not going to make it successful. The only way you can be successful is to take responsibility for your choices and your actions. And as an EOS community, we need to take responsibility for the token. And the way I'm attempting to contribute to that is, well, we need a way to reach consensus, right, on subjective funding of community projects. Subjective consensus that does not get gained is the most challenging problem in the space. Whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or EOS, money needs to come from somewhere to fund development and to build the infrastructure required to grow a community. And whatever algorithm you use, whether it's proof of work and then some informal backroom deals between mining pools and exchanges and people who happen to control the GitHub repo, right? They can do hard forks and things like that. Or Ethereum. Ethereum just did a hard fork, and they've got some off-chain ad hoc governance process based upon incumbent influencers that just say this is what's going to happen. These are actually centralized organizations with a veil of decentralization. The problem with EOS is it actually has been too decentralized to coordinate, to agree on funding, and it's been that way because people thought it was centralized in Block.one, but Block.one wasn't doing anything, right? And so everyone is sitting back and saying, oh, we don't have to do anything. We do all this stuff, and it's Block.one. That's only centralized because the community was expecting Block.one to be the centralized party that is, I guess, guiding their future profits. If that was what Block.one was, then the SEC should have taken Block.one down. But Block.one never said they were going to do that. But people didn't take Block.one at its word.
True, but I think the promise that Brendan made gave the impression that there would be a lot more funding for small, medium-sized projects. And, one could argue, let's look at Eden very briefly before we go into deeper. Eden's a project that needs some seed funding, right? I mean, I'm sure the community has funded it. You may have funded it. And without that seed funding, it wouldn't have existed. And some other projects on EOS would have listened to what Brendan has said, would have expected some of that seed funding, whether it came through an individual VC or a foundation or whatever. And I think because those promises were made, that created at least the illusion that that would be how Block.one would react.
Yeah, I can tell you that Block.one was trying to do funding, and I was pushing initiatives. And one of the challenges was Block.one would spend more money on due diligence than they would on funding.
Yeah, completely pointless.
You can't give somebody $100,000 of seed money and then spend $100,000 in legal due process to just the numbers don't add up, and you say, well, why are we doing all this? It's just too small to even think about it. Now we're left with, we have to do millions of dollars of funding to justify the due diligence, and those projects require so much greater teams. There's so many fewer teams that can justify millions of dollars of investment, and you get into this thing where we can't do anything, and they eventually did some grants. They tried to do 100 or so grants. I was promoting projects that I thought should deserve some grants. As far as I'm aware, they never actually got funding, even with my endorsement. So it's it's been a challenge, but that's, Block.one is doing bullish. That is what's happening. We have to get past what's happened, because we all would have liked something different. I would have liked something different. I was hoping that Block.one would be a company that would support all the things I want to do in governance and things like that, but it's not the case. So I left Block.one, and as a result of Block.one, I had time to write my book, which really dives into all the challenges with governance. And this is both with traditional democracies, as well as other blockchains and Steam and EOS and vote buying and trading, and how game theory gets corrupted and how political parties form, and all these things derive from Pareto principle and limits on human cognition and rational ignorance, and yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of things that come into play why governance systems get corrupted. And then the incumbent parties come to power, they control things, and then they kind of milk it for their own personal profit until they're acted on by an outside force. And this all boils down to actually the root of individual liberty. And how do you protect the independence of the individual, maximize individual power, right? In theory, that's what blockchain cryptocurrency was supposed to do. It's supposed to take power away from the banks and give it back to the people. And then if we have economic power, because we've got our own money that's not being inflated, then we can start to get ahead. But the entire cryptocurrency world has been slowly taken over by regulations. All the exchanges are now doing KYC, or they get shut down. The transaction fees are too high for people to transact directly as a currency. The tax compliance is too onerous with capital gains and losses that need to be transacted on every single thing. And now the new regulations they're proposing to make everyone, potentially even software developers, brokers, that need to be regulated and licensed. It's getting to a point where it's actually quite clear that technology and cryptocurrency as it's currently conceived will not be enough to achieve things, because you need a political consensus building system among people that cannot be corrupted, so they can reach consensus, and then they can reach consensus on using a new currency. They can reach consensus on freedom to do things and things like that. But without the ability of a group of people to reach consensus outside of the controlled government and controlled media and controlled internet, then it's really, really hard to achieve freedom. It's really, really hard to achieve the goals of Bitcoin, which is digital money. Like, I was trying to create Bitcoin when I discovered Bitcoin, because I realized we needed a digital currency that the governments couldn't just show up and steal all the gold that's backing it like they did e-gold. Right? It needs to be a scarce resource that's invisible and can be transmitted over the internet in the information age. I knew those requirements needed to be met. And so that's why I was trying to create Bitcoin. That's why I got into this space. But that's just one piece. And we've kind of solved what we can actually do honest money if we have a governance structure of people that can keep the money honest. Keeping the money honest is subjective. So what I see is the opportunity for EOS to pivot into a community that can self-govern, not just over the protocol, but over subjective matters. It can be a decentralized country that can coordinate people toward a common action. And that common action, my hope, is that it will be toward individual independence and freedom, financial freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, freedom of speech. And if we can get people to rally behind those principles and then to reach consensus on using community funds, which all inflation, all printing money is community funds. That's economic power to influence the world. And if we can coordinate that economic power in a way that helps, that benefits all the individuals involved and the network as a whole, then we can turn the ship around. EOS has a purpose. It has something that's more than just another token that can pump and go to the moon, because it's up to something bigger, and it's providing value to the users directly. So that's where I'd like to see things go.
I remember studying politics in school, and my teacher would explain what a government was, and they would describe a government as the mission of a government was to find an equilibrium, to kind of placate two opposing sides. However, you pitch consensus. So my question would be, how does searching for an equilibrium differ from building a consensus, and why is consensus optimal in non-conflict, non-violent conflict resolution?
Searching for an equilibrium is just a consensus. It's the point at which people have peace, and it might be a peace backed by a gun, but there's consensus. I'm going to do what you're going to say because I don't want you to pull the trigger. Right? That's a form of consensus. In my book, I actually say it's not about that. It's about, hey, I'm an individual. We're living in the law of the jungle. Might makes right. You and I teaming up are going to be stronger together if we can reach consensus on how to act together, right? And the two of us working together is stronger than the two of us working independently without coordination, right? And so the political systems today attempt to divide us, because the more they divide us, the stronger they become because they're coordinated, right? And there's different consensus systems. You have one consensus system, which is sort of like, we've got the leader and everyone agrees to follow the leader, and that's great. There's consensus. It could even be voluntary. Everyone's following the leader. But the people can lose their independence. The leader could be a king. He could become a tyrant. He can tax all the people. He can do whatever he wants. And it's not necessarily representative of the people. And it's a trap, right? So any individual who says, wait a second, I want to protect my freedom, my autonomy. I want to maximize my power. And when you maximize your power in the world, you actually end up maximizing your economic viability and sustainability. And so how do I join up with other people without basically submitting to someone else? And now I'm a slave and I lose my power. And once I give up my power, I can't get it back. Right? That's the challenge that countries face. Hey, the states joined the United States, and then when they try to secede, nope, sorry, we're going to invade. You're not allowed to secede. They gave up their power to a centralized organization, and then they couldn't retract it. And
just can I just ask you a question just on that point? Sorry to interrupt, because that's a really interesting point. So given you describe a state's dependence as the inability to leave a democratic infrastructure because the pain of doing so is too great, and therefore that state is a slave to that master set, and that's tyrannical, right? So what do you make of the UK's decision then to leave the European Union and the European Union's attempts to make it almost too painful for the UK to leave?
It's the typical abuse scenario, right? You're in an abusive relationship. They try to isolate you and cut you off and make it too painful to leave. So you'll stay and keep taking the abuse, and they can sap your energy. And the only way to escape abuse is to go through the suffering and the hard times to regain your independence. The abuser never wants the abused party to leave, right? They're going to make it as painful as possible and everything, but it's just a cycle of abuse that it happens within domestic abuse. It happens within states and other forms of organizations as they submit to one another. But it's really a question of dependence. When you end up, your whole life depends upon a single source for your technology or your food or whatever, you no longer have independence. They might say, oh yeah, sure. I'll provide all your food and I'm not going to try to control you. You might feel free, but you're not actually free, because the moment they decide, hey, I want something that you have, then it becomes, give it to me or no food. You're not actually free. And we see that with Google and Apple say, do as we say, or no app store for you, no phone for you, right? It's all of a sudden we've become dependent on technology. And these technology companies then control, so we become dependent upon energy, or regulations have restricted competition. And now, all food has to flow through USDA, right? It's this pattern of independent people that are free, born free in nature, losing their independence when they join a political body that they originally formed for the purposes of protecting their independence and protecting their freedoms and protecting their rights, right? That's why we created the United States. That's why we left Britain, right? And Britain tried to prevent the colonies from leaving. Ironically, now they're trying to leave the European Union, right? It's like,
the irony's not lost.
The hypocrisy, is great. But if you just accept the principle that people have a right to be independent, and then it's a challenge. Well, all right, if you start off with a bunch of independent people, how do they work together to protect their independence without losing it? And that's what my book's all about. It's, at the time I was writing my book, I didn't have the word fractal. I wish I had, because I want to rewrite the whole book around the word fractal now. But governance needs to be fractal in nature, which means, it's grouped at a higher level. It's like just a repeat of the pattern that's at a lower level.
Democracies,
and then there's autonomy between it. Yeah, democracies of democracies. So the United States should be a democracy of states. Each state should have one vote. And
why should each state have one vote? Why should one state?
Because democracies can only be of equals. If you view your body as a democracy of cells, okay, and then you have 10 people in a room and say, we're going to perform democracy of people. Are you going to give the person who's fatter more votes because he's got more cells? Right? These are independent organizations, independent people. You can only have democracy among equals, because if you don't have democracy among equals, then that's when the abuse starts. The stronger party with more votes ends up saying, hey, I get more say because I'm bigger. And
doesn't the strongest party then always have to concede power to the weakest to form this consensus and equilibrium?
No, the equals start up, and when they join, they make sure they're equal, and they only admit new people that are equal.
Okay.
And so, from my perspective, let's say the state of California, it's a really big state.
Very valuable.
And then you've got like North Dakota, a very small state in terms of people. And how do these two states become, cooperate together? Well, there's no competition. California could crush the other one if there was a war between the two. California could crush them economically. At no point would North Dakota want to cede their independence to any type of governance structure that gives California 3 votes and then 1 vote, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm just going to be a slave to California just because they're bigger. So the way that it should be done is California should be broken up into independent states the size of North Dakota. Now you might have 10 states in California and North Dakota forming 11 states that all come together and say, we're going to have a democracy. Now, the key here is that those other states, they have to actually be truly independent. If they're colluding, right, and they say, hey, we're 10 states, but we're really acting as one, then all of a sudden, North Dakota's like, no, that's not a legitimate thing, and they should secede and maintain their independence. And there's always this economic incentive to collude and centralize, because you get efficiencies because you only have the amount of governance and the amount of redundancy in the system is reduced, and therefore there's economic savings associated with coming together. And that's why things get bigger and bigger. But as things get bigger and bigger, people lose their independence. And independence is something that's valuable. And if you don't value it, then you're not going to give up anything. You're not going to pay anything for it. So the real challenge, in a group of people that value independence, and they know that they're willing to pay to have redundancy, right? Which means you're going to be paying more for the redundancy to maintain your options, whether it's redundancy in food providers, redundancy in technology companies, redundancy in internet service providers, or redundancy in power companies, whatever it might be. If you're not paying for that redundancy, then you end up with centralized control, loss of liberty, and now you're paying for monopoly.
Yeah.
And monopolies create, once they got you dependent, prices go up, and now you're dependent without the redundancy, and you're paying more. But there's this short-sightedness of, I'm going to save $1 today by buying at Walmart instead of the local store, and then next thing you know, all the local stores are gone, and you have to buy at Walmart, and they can start raising their prices, right? You lost your freedom, you lost the competition, you lost your local diversity, and now you've got the same international, like, Chinese goods that everyone else has. And if anything ever happens, like China goes on lockdown and locks their ports up, and shipping containers can't get here, now you have shortages, and there's no one in your town that can produce the things you need. And it's just a problem when we give up independence to save a buck. And this is where the coordination problem comes into play, because people have incentive to say, well, if everyone else is shopping at the local stores, I can save $1 by buying at Walmart, and but I still have my freedom because other people support these other businesses. But if everyone makes that decision to selfishly save themselves money, then everyone's going to lose. It's a prisoner's dilemma, right? We all rat each other out because we're trying to get free, and then we all get longer term sentences. So that's where you need subjective enforcement of community values for independence, which is why I'm a big fan of import-export taxes to protect the autonomy and independence of political zones, right? And if you can incentivize people to keep all commerce locally and buy local, and minimize the incentives of them to create dependencies on foreign powers and foreign communities, foreign whatever, then you can get your independence back. But we got into the blockchain space, cryptocurrency, EOS, smart contracts. These are tools to be used by an independent people. But if you're not independent, you can't use these tools because they'll be outlawed. And you'll be forced into the same box as everyone else. And even though we have the tools, we're not allowed to have websites that advertise the tools. We're not allowed to promote the tools, and we're going to be taxed. The tools don't matter if you're not allowed to use it. So you need the political freedom, the freedom of speech, and you need the tools to reach consensus that, hey, we want this freedom, and we're going to work together toward this goal in a mutual aid society kind of way. And then we can have smart contracts and things like that. Without that, smart contracts and cryptographic keys and everything else become a tool of tyranny, a control grid, a mark of the beast, right? Where you can't buy or sell without government ID. And if you don't do what they say, it gets turned off. And because everyone has cryptographic keys and everything is super secure, it's very hard for people to hack around it with forgeries and other things like that. Blockchains can be used as a tool of tyranny if they're used to enforce the regulations. And that's the, it's not just about technology. This is fundamentally about people and empowering people.
So then, what is a true democracy?
A true democracy is a democracy that is voluntary, as in it's consensual, and it's representative. It's representative of the people, and it's representative over time. not just at an instant. And the challenge with getting a representative thing, it's not just about voting, because even if you had elections that had complete voting integrity, right? There's no fraud in the voting itself. You can have political parties that form, and those political parties basically create a two-party system. And so if you set up your voting structures first past, whoever gets the most votes wins, you're going to get the party system. And then it doesn't matter what the consensus is among the people, it's about the parties and what's the consensus algorithm used in the political parties. Because the political parties are a collusive group of people with a different governance structure that are taking control of the reins of the official consensus algorithm to do what they want. So it's like all the block producers colluding to do what they want. In theory, they're supposed to represent token holders, but they've got some backroom deal going on, and they're the ones that control the keys, and they use that power to do what they want. So it's very, very challenging to create a system that represents the people. And the way that I've identified this best, so random sampling will be representative over time. If you randomly select from the population, then there's no campaigning, there's nothing else. And over time, it's going to incorporate everyone's ideas, right? And there's no way to become an incumbent. There's no way to form a political party because it's going to be random. And so it's just going to be what the people think on average. The problem is there's a Pareto distribution when it comes to wisdom of governance and wisdom of managing and all those other things. And a random sampling is going to say, like, picking your Olympic team by random. It's going to be representative of the country overall, but you're going to lose every single Olympics. And it's going to be disastrous. So what you want to do is you want to have some kind of test or skill, a skill-based competition that will identify the top 100 athletes and then randomly select among them. Right? And idea, right? That will still be representative of the people to the extent that it's representative of the best of the people, as long as the game that they're playing selects for good qualities instead of bad qualities. So with the current political systems, there's certain skills that are needed, the ability to be extroverted, to look good on camera, to be willing to lie, to do backroom deals, whatever, cheat, right? All these things are the skills necessary to win the game of politics, which are not necessarily, people don't want to, those willing to tell people what they want to hear instead of hard truth win under the current game. And so Pareto principle takes over. The worst of the worst, or the best bad people are the ones that are promoted. And as systems get bigger, it's just like, if you have a small school, you're not going to have a very good basketball team because you don't have enough population to get the best of the best filtered. The bigger the population gets, the better the team gets because you got a bigger population, and then the normal distribution of skills, whatever it is, you get more of those outliers that are extremely good, or in the case of politics, extremely bad. And yet the number of people that are required to govern stays relatively fixed, right? You have 500 or so people that run this country, the United States, regardless of the population, right? And so over time, as the population grows, those people necessarily get more corrupt to the extent that the game that put them in power selects for corruption. And that's why things need to be fractal, because you keep the democracy small, right? You're talking about a democracy of 10,000 people or less, just like leaders. And then when you have democracies, that's groups of less than 10,000 people, right? And so, in theory, the United States should be a democracy of 3,000 counties, right? If the United States was a democracy of 3,000 counties, with each county getting one vote, they're all approximately equal in power. They all have the ability to secede, but you're not going to get the corruption that you get today. And people can move from one county to another county easily if one county gets too corrupt. It's kind of like people move from one state to another. And then if you look at a heat map of how all the counties vote, you realize that the policies that would get put forward would be vastly different than the policies that say the population centers where there's the most corruption control the entire state, which then controls the entire country. So that's why fractal governance is key. And that's why keeping things small is key, because Pareto distribution will take over and select for the worst of the worst. So there's another aspect of true democracy when it comes to representatives. It's how much power does the individual have? If it's a democracy by popular vote, like the United States, or certain people advocate the United States to be, then you have 1 in 300 million. That's your influence.
Nothing.
Under a fractal system, right? It's log n. So that's a computer science term, but you're not 1 in 300 million. You're 1 in, from a fractal perspective, you got your local group, which you're 1 in like 10, and then you've got your county, which is going to be 1 in 10, and so forth. If you look at all the people that,
I was going to say, why don't you explain the hierarchal representative voting? Because I think that's the core of what you're kind of getting to.
Yeah. So actually, I would go with fractal representative voting is actually probably a better way than hierarchical. Okay. But the idea is you randomly group people into groups. It's 5 to 10 people. They have to reach consensus on someone to delegate their authority to, and then if they can't reach a 2/3 + 1 consensus, Byzantine fault tolerant, then that group doesn't get to promote a delegate to the next level. And then you take all the people that were selected from the first group, randomly group them, and so forth. It's like a basketball tournament, right? You take all the teams, you randomly pair them off, they play a game, you see who wins, and then you repeat the process, and eventually you get a winner. Now you do the exact same kind of thing, and that works within an independent territory, which I think that's what should be working at the county level and below. But then once you have enough people to have an independent community that's got everything you need, and you don't necessarily need to rely on outside sources, then the fractal repeats, and the community is the unit, and this community works with 100 other communities, and they're randomly assigned representatives until you find the representatives of the communities. But there's a critical thing about the fractal nature of things. You can't have, say, the federal government directly interacting with the citizens of a state, because they'll tax the citizens without their representatives, without respecting the boundaries of the independent units that are supposed to govern it, which undermines the ability to secede, undermines the independence. The analogy is, are you going to join a local democracy voluntarily if upon joining you give that community authority over the cells in your body to directly sap energy and directly control the cells in your body? You'd say, no, it's going to impact my independence and my ability to reach consensus over my body joining this other community. And that's how the states lost their freedom, is they allowed the federal government to directly tax the people. Instead, the federal government should tax the states, and the state should collect the taxes and pay it to the Fed. That way the state has the ability to say, no, we're not going to pay you anymore, and the people don't have to change anything because they're only paying to the state. And the state can say, yeah, we're getting more benefit from being part of the federal government than not. And if it ever changed, then that's the case, that they can secede easily because they haven't created so many ties that all the business just, it's so much pain to leave that they can't leave, and therefore they don't leave, and the slavery continues until the whole thing collapses.
So I mean, I totally agree with you in the sense that the political party system is broken and it's detrimental to society. I mean, I think it has been since the 18th century, and I do think the future is independent politicians forming consensus. But I mean, if you look at other political systems like proportional representation, for example, or alternative voting systems, they tend to create coalition governments, and coalition governments at the end actually work towards creating consensus because they have to, way more than a first past the post, winner takes all kind of system. So I just wondered, did you look into those other voting systems, and did you see any virtue or value in those, and maybe think about integrating some of those into some of your concepts?
Yes, I've looked at these other systems. These other systems solve some of the problems, but not all of the problems. They're not focused on maintaining the independence of the groups. So even if you have a coalition governance system, coalition is just another word for collusion, right? It's like all the states of former California forming a coalition against North Dakota. Yeah, but there's not independence, and it's the principle of independence and the ability to secede that are the fundamental principles behind the structures I'm proposing, versus saying, well, we got 100 million people, how are we going to measure what the consensus is? Right? Well, the reality is if you've got half the people think one thing, half the people think the other, they should have their own independence, they should do their own thing, but instead it's this half gets to tell that half what to do. Or if it's one of these other systems, you've got 5 groups, each controlling 20% approximately. Of course, that's going to be Pareto distributed. One group's going to control 40%, the next going to control 20, the next going to control 10, and so forth. And then they kind of reach a consensus, but whatever the consensus is enforced on everyone, and no one has the autonomy to leave because they've given up the autonomy and the ability to set their own direction. So
I want to talk a little bit about leaders and the desire for decentralization, generally to have a leaderless infrastructure. But what I find quite interesting is the continual need for a leader. So I would contest that the notion of a leaderless democratic process is perhaps just a fallacy, and perhaps even a fool's errand. And I would contest then that a good leadership is not temporary, as I believe you and Yves wrote in your Medium article recently, but it is in fact permanent. And therefore the innovation should be focused with the safeguarding of the ascension process, ensuring, as you would say, only a philosopher king may ascend to the throne and not a self-serving king, rather than trying to build a system that can operate without a leader. Would you not agree with that?
I think largely agree with what you just stated. The key is to prevent incumbent advantage. You need a leader. A leader is just the expression of consensus. Without a leader, you've got 100 different opinions about which way to go, and people going in all different directions, and you don't have coordination. If you want the benefits of coordination, which there are clear benefits to coordination, then you want a leader. The problem is, the reason we've rebelled against leaders is because leaders get into power, then they stay in power, and then they use that power for their own end and not for the people that put them in power. And then the people that put them in power are powerless to take it back and replace them. And even something like Bitcoin, which theoretically is leaderless, it's not. There's media and
Blockstream,
people that control the infrastructure and things like that, core developers. There are leaders that people follow. Ethereum, Vitalik, he's the leader. Even EOS, to some extent, I am the leader of EOS because people choose to follow me. They signed up, right? They chose me in the first place, and so they continue to want me to lead. Now, the reason we want things to be decentralized is another reason for decentralization, which is not just we don't trust a leader. It's the governments like to say, hey, take the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. If you have a leader that is like a Vitalik or me or whoever is leading these other projects, and the government comes and takes them down, how do you select a new leader? how do you reach consensus on the new leader? And if you don't have the ability to reach consensus on the new leader, then you're taken over, right? So let's say you're part of a country. A foreign country can take over your country by just taking over your leadership. Boop. We now control everybody because everyone's got you, right? So, but if this country says, you know what? Oh, you bribed or assassinated our leader, and then try to install your sock puppet. Well, we have a means of reaching consensus on selecting a new leader. One of the biggest problems I think we have is when we have an election, the media controls who's electable. If you never hear of someone, how are you going to vote for them? If they can't get on the ballot because they control the process of that, then what do you do? If you can't even get through the political parties, because the political parties have some non-democratic, all kinds of arbitrary rules that they use to vet the people that can ascend in a party and to foil the people, whether it's Ron Paul or Bernie Sanders or to some extent even Donald Trump. They'll try to foil things at the party level and then control who can actually be on the ballot. And so the key is to protect the process by which a leader is selected among the people, such that the power does not transfer from the voters to the media or from the voters to the political parties. And the media being completely controlled by a small group of people. That's the real power structure in a democracy, because they control what people think. They control the information people see. They can, and so there's the official formal, this is the control structure, and then there's all the attempts of people to organize outside the official structure to take over the official structure and then claim legitimacy. And that's why people want things to be decentralized. But you do need leaders, and leaders are just an expression of consensus. And you need leaders that are not incumbent. You said they were permanent. I don't think that's the right answer. If you find a good leader,
the need for a leader was permanent rather than temporary.
The need for a leader is permanent, yes, but you don't want any one person to have incumbent power forever, because incumbent power corrupts. It creates an incentive to gain power, and then once you get power, you want to change the rules to prevent anyone else from coming in and getting power the same way you got the power. That's why when I'm designing Eden, which is implementing the ideas of my book on EOS, I'm trying to design a system to make sure that I cannot just be elected because I'm the favorite, right? Or any other influencer isn't just guaranteed to win. And that's because we actually do use a random process. The community has to pick 5 to 10 potential leaders, and then we randomly select among those potential leaders. And in that way, over time, it's going to represent the people. And no one person is ever guaranteed power, no matter how popular they are.
Well, I mean, I agree, because obviously absolute power corrupts, absolutely. But absolute powerlessness, it does the same. So I guess my question would be, what process, well, can you describe the process that led to the selection of Yves La Rose as the potential temporary leader of the new EOS Foundation institution?
Well, the way I view it is delegated proof of stake is like shareholders electing a board. Yves has good connections with everyone on the board, right? Great connections in China, and they all trust him, and they all chose him to be the representative of the block producers. I view him as just a representative of the block producers, sort of like appointing a CEO under DPoS, right? The block producers are the board, and now Yves is the CEO. Yves now has the ability to delegate to Eden, which is a group of people that's using the governance process I've laid out, the fractal governance to select leaders and allocate budgets. So I view Yves and the foundation as just a way of the block producers coordinating for the purposes of funding the development of Eden, and then given a budget to Eden. And eventually, once Eden is well enough established and has perfected the continuity of control over keys and accounts and smart contracts and funding, then Yves' role as the foundation is potentially no longer needed. Because Yves is just a means of facilitating all the block producers coordinating to transition to true democracy.
So why was Yves chosen without a fractional representative voting system? And why was he anointed, for want of a better phrase?
He was chosen based on block producers' choice to fund him. I said that I would support him so long as he's agreeing to fund Eden, right? And he likes Eden. Eden is the concepts in my book. So if he's funding Eden and moving in that direction, then I support whatever means the block producers want to do to coordinate to reach a decision on how to allocate inflation to the true Eden and so forth. So I just view it as an extension of delegated proof of stake. The elected block producers, elected via the token holders, have selected or chosen him. Now, obviously, my opinion matters. And so the block producers care that I support Yves. And I support Yves only because he's willing to take the risk of that role and is willing to support the transition to it. I kind of view it as a Roman emperor being appointed for the sole purpose of handing power back to the Senate. That is,
Caesar.
you know, it's an interim role, in my opinion. Now we'll see if it creates an incumbent position and power corrupts and all those other things. But it's a step in the right direction. It gives us a leader. It gives us the ability to make choices, and that's better than being stuck and unable to do anything and unable to fund anything or do anything decisive. So I think that even if Yves is less than ideal, it's better than the uncoordinated chaos we have now.
I think Yves is the perfect choice, to be honest. I'm just interested at how he got that role, given we have this incredible voting system that wasn't utilized. But I understand the process why, but I think it was good for you to explain that. I guess then we've kind of talked a little bit about the grants and the foundation. So I kind of want to circle back to that because I think that's kind of the most breaking news really in the community that's really got everyone excited again. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what the foundation aims to do and how quickly do you think it will be able to achieve its goals?
Well, when it comes to the foundation and its goals and speed at which it can do it, that's all on Yves. I'm leading Eden through the and I'm just going to even saying, hey, fund what I'm doing. And so I'm hoping that they'll fund Eden very, very quickly. But in terms of timetable of how long is it going to take to get the block producers to agree to sign things? How long is it going to take Yves to approve funding to various organizations? You have to talk to him because the foundation in my mind is just a legal structure around him as a person. It's not representative of the people. It's just the structure that he's set up to protect himself legally in this situation.
And is it a temporary organization then until Eden really gets on its feet and closes that gap there?
That's what I'm advocating for, is that it's temporary and that the goal is to fund the development of Eden as quickly as possible to the point that Eden is able to pick representatives, have those representatives vet projects and grant funding to projects, and do so in a way that is resistant to corruption and representative of the actual members, the real people in like a democratic kind of way, so that people are comfortable that Eden will continue to be Eden and continue to abide by its principles, and regardless of who comes and goes, right? You don't have to worry that one day Yves gets hit by a bus and somebody else takes over his company, and the next thing you know, it's not. It's being run by his corrupt son, right? Emperor. Yeah, themes of Gladiator here, right?
Are you really Satoshi Nakamoto, Dan? And if you're not, then who is?
I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you.
Very good answer. Okay, then, to conclude, Mike Maloney famously described you as, I believe, a freedom engineer. And I think he was right. You are building the tools to freedom. Decentralized blockchains, independent digital currencies, political manifestos, which instruct total infrastructure and democratic overhauls, improved voting processes and vote value. And you're even building decentralized communications. It's a shame we didn't get to speak about Clarin OS today. So Daniel, it would appear that you are, and are you specifically developing the tools not just for freedom, but to fuel an entire social and economic revolution like which the world has never seen before?
It's my hope that it will transform people, that I can bring the ideas, right? Ideas are more powerful than bullets, right? V for Vendetta. You can't kill an idea whose time has come. I think that the biggest thing I can do is to get the word out. What you're doing here on this call is helping get the word out around the ideas of things. And it's not just about freedom, because freedom is only one half. You need responsibility. Independence is what I'm going for, because you can have freedom when you're independent. You can also have freedom when you're a slave, but it's subject to rules, right? And so what a lot of people say is, I don't want any responsibility. I want the freedom to go out and party all day and not have to work ever, right? That's the definition of freedom that a lot of people have. And I think that makes freedom a poor choice. Right? We signed the Declaration of Independence, not the Declaration of Freedom. Right? We want to be independent of our parents, not free of our parents. You can't get free without being independent. Otherwise, you just have the illusion of freedom. So independence is the key, and that means hard work. That means personal responsibility. That means a lot of things that people don't want to take on for themselves because it's hard. It means sacrifice. And people say, oh, I have to sacrifice. That's not freedom. Freedom is being rich. And they think that if you have all the money in the world, you're free. Newsflash, the more money you have, the more enslaved you are, because it's all contingent upon your continued compliance with the system, or they take it all. And that's, sometimes the most free people are the ones that are actually quite poor, but they've got their family and they've got their food, and they're doing it all on their own. They don't need a whole lot of other things. That's the most free people, because they're the most independent people. Freedom is the ability to say no. If you don't have the ability to say no, then you are not free. And that's where independence comes in. So I'm an independence engineer, is probably a more accurate way to say that I'm creating tools for independence. And when you have independence, you are free.
Dan, thank you so much for your time, and
Yes,
I hope you'll join us
you.
again in the next few weeks to discuss more of the community overall.
Yes, this is a great conversation. Thank you for having me.